All right, welcome back. So this mini lecture is going to talk about John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy. And we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know to go learn a little bit more about the president and a little bit more about this complex individual who was the president of the United States during a difficult and transitionary time period in U.S. history. So let's dig in. So the first thing, if we're talking broadly about President Kennedy, would be family and World War II. So the Kennedy family, of course, was a storied family. His father, of course, was also connected very much to democratic politics and to diplomacy, and was famed for his connections to possibly bootlegging, and then eventually the Great Depression, and then the Roosevelts, and there's a lot there. Kennedy himself comes of age, and eventually will serve in the U.S. Navy during World War II, becomes partly famous because of his command of a PT boat that is eventually sunk, and he has to rescue some of his shipmates, some of his crew, and this will eventually be made later into a movie and will become a very popular film and part of JFK's story. Secondly, the Democrats in the 1950s. So after World War II, John F. Kennedy comes back home and eventually gets involved in Democratic Party politics. Now, Kennedy was someone who struggled with health in the 1940s and 50s because of his injuries suffered from his World War II service, but he's entering Democratic politics at a time when the party is transforming a bit. So you had, in the early 1930s, a coalition built around parts of the New Deal, and a strong support for that particular kind of governmental approach. President Truman in 48 was as well implementing a sort of version of a New Deal. And so by the 1950s, the towering figures in the Democratic Party are going to be individuals like Adlai Stevenson. But you're starting to see some writing on the wall for what we might call the new left of the early 1960s, but it's not fully there yet. Thirdly, missile gap. So John F. Kennedy gets himself elected as a senator from the state of Massachusetts, and by the end of the 1950s is going to decide to throw his hat in the ring for the presidency. Now, probably the more powerful Democratic political figure in the Senate is, of course, Lyndon Johnson in 1960, but Kennedy has a number of things going for him. And Kennedy is someone who tries in the run-up to the campaign, the election, to stress this idea that the United States is in a missile gap with the Soviet Union, that they have a number of more missiles than we do, and so we need to sort of close the gap, right, this kind of thing. Now, the president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, knew that we weren't actually in a missile gap, but Kennedy is able to effectively exploit this, amongst a number of other things, in his campaign against Richard Nixon, Vice President Richard Nixon. Now, the fourth thing for us to note when it comes to Senator and now President Kennedy is the Cold War. So President Kennedy is elected in 1960. He takes office in early 1961, and he begins a new approach, perhaps, to foreign policy. Kennedy is in many ways is interested in the Cold War, in some ways to the detriment of domestic policy, or at least his outlook in domestic policy is shaped by his foreign policy sort of approaches. Kennedy wants to be able to challenge the Soviet Union and to, of course, stop their advances globally. So things like issues over civil rights in the U.S., some of this is, of course, that Kennedy wants citizens to be treated equally, but it's a question of how does the U.S. look in the constructs of the Cold War. He's traveling to Berlin, supported the creation of the Green Berets, the creation of the Peace Corps, right? These kinds of things that are happening in the early 1960s. We need to view this all through the lens of the Cold War. Number 5, assassination myths. So President Kennedy was sadly shot and killed in November of 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, if you are someone who is a great believer in myths and conspiracy theories and all this kind of thing, then there is a wide variety of theories that you can pick and choose from for what really happened that led to the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, Generally, what are the basic facts that we know? Was Lee Harvey Oswald involved? Yeah. Does President Kennedy sadly get assassinated? Yeah. Is there wiggle room to say that there were others who maybe wanted to see President Kennedy assassinated? Yeah. That's certainly the case. But generally, we can at least reasonably say that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved there. All right. Yeah, that's about it. So thanks so much.